Welcome to the GOTA virtual conference. Scan the QR code on the left to participate in our silent auction. The silent auction will run from October 1st to October 29th of 2020. Scan the QR code on the right to go to the GOTA online store. Thank you to our 2020 sponsors. Platinum level sponsor, the Shepherd Center. Gold level sponsors, All About Kids Therapy Services in the University of St. Augustine. And silver level sponsor, Hanger Clinic.
Shepherd Center specializes in medical treatment, research, and rehabilitation for people with spinal cord and brain injury.
We see 400 individuals with brain injury a year. We see over 350 individuals with spinal cord injury a year. Our staff have the expertise, we have the knowledge, and our outcomes exceed national averages.
Okay, all right. Good evening. My name is Mary Shotwell, and I am one of the presenters for this presentation on concurrent validity of indoor mobility, a pre-driver screening tool. And a little bit about me. I have been an OT for 37 years, have practiced in all areas. I have worked in the area of driver rehabilitation probably in the last 15, 20 years, more doing research related to driving, and in particular validating measures related to driving. I am on the ADED research committee, it's just my belief that therapists need quick and easy assessments to use in practice. This study is the result of the first author's project for his OTD capstone. And we collaborated together on this project. So you'll learn more about it. And Nick couldn't be with us this evening, and his practice area right now is long-term care gerontology. So our objectives are just to kind of do an overview of assessments in general. What do we look at when we're looking at assessment in driver rehab? And that really is like the in-clinic portion, the screening, the assessment, the evaluation before they get on the road. And then to talk about our assessment, the indoor mobility pre-driver screening, which I'll introduce you to the really author of that test. I'm just the helper at validating this measure. And then research on this tool that I've been doing since 2011. And then to discuss Nick's project and the results of his concurrent validity study. So when we think about driving, so if you're a clinical generalist, and even if you're working with like young adults, teenagers, older adults, people with brain injuries, spinal cord injury, and the first thing a lot of these clients say is, I want to drive. Sometimes they don't care about dressing or bathing, they want to drive. So we have to kind of like sort of look at 4 big categories of functions and say to ourselves, well, do they have the vision? Do they have acuity? Do they have the scanning? Do they have the visual perception? What about cognition? Do they have the attention, particularly divided attention, alternating attention? What about memory, sequencing, judgment, impulse control, all those kinds of executive function skills? And then the motor skills. Do they have the range of motion, the strength, kind of the coordination, the reaction time in order to drive a vehicle? And then other sensory functions. Obviously, you can drive and not be a hearing person, but there would be some challenges if you were hearing impaired. Proprioceptive is a bigger concern, particularly with our people with amputations who don't have good sensation in their feet, and some of them are resistive to using hand controls, touch, and vestibular functions. And this is probably the reason why there is no one assessment that measures someone's ability or predictive ability to get out on the road, because clients have different deficit areas in each of these 4 categories. And you probably all are aware of Mary Warren's vision hierarchy. And basically, she, at the base of the pyramid, is all of the foundational skills that are kind of associated with our cranial nerves and our ocular functions, ocular motor control, visual acuity, all the way up to the top of the pyramid, which is adaptation through vision. So what do I do with the visual information that I take in? And obviously right below that is visual cognition. So just keep that in mind as we kind of talk. And so what are some of the typical screenings we do in the driver rehabilitation world? And when I say driver rehabilitation world, I'm also talking about clinical generalists. So you work in a skilled nursing facility, you work in rehab, you work in outpatient rehab, and your clients say they want to drive. My recommendation is do some of these screening tools, and maybe you'll learn our little tool and you can use it or get a copy of it. I'll send it to you. And use it in your facility to kind of like, see whether you should then refer on to the driver rehab specialist. All these screening things, by the way, are billable in your setting for the most part. So typically, a generalist might do some of these screenings and then refer to a driver rehabilitation specialist. And many insurances, certainly Medicare, is not going to be paying for the on-the-road evaluation. So whatever portion of the eval, the screening piece, could be done in a billable capacity, will be good for the client and good to save them money. And it saves the resource of a driver rehabilitation specialist to really do more of the intense evaluations in the clinic and the screening, the behind the wheel evaluation. So what could you do as a generalist? Obviously, you could test visual acuity from the Snellen chart, contrast sensitivity, which you might not have a machine to do that, but the Optec 2500 or whatever, the machine has different visual assessments embedded in it. And a driver rehab specialist would probably do that one, but like visual motor function, right? We all know that. Cognitive status, obviously, you probably have some tools that you like, the MOCA, the slums. Therapists in the driver world will tell you about the trails and a maze test, the Bell's cancellation test, all those kinds of things. And then obviously the physical function and so forth. The other thing at the bottom, which really isn't an assessment, it's just we want to be mindful that people have to be seizure-free or syncope-free, per the DMV standards in every state. Some states is 6 months, whatever, different states have different requirements. Now, in terms of the hierarchy of assessment, nothing replaces the behind the wheel assessment. But the next level would be maybe a driving simulator. And then we have something called the UFOV. Some of you might know the Dynavision and the bits, and they have little subtests that sort of simulate a UFOB. It's not the same thing. UFOB is useful field of view. And the useful field of view test came out of UAB. Actually, it was a psychologist, Carlene Ball. And it kind of has several subtests, but it's like a car appears in the visual field and it does reaction time, but it measures where in the visual field you're having a problem. And there's sub programs similar to that on many driving simulators as well. Similarly, the Dynavision and the Bioness, I forget what you call, it's like a trainer. It looks like the Dynavision. It's on a flat screen TV. Also can map one's field of view, if you will. The downside of the Dynavision and the bits is the screens aren't to the side of people. They're just central visual field, but they are bigger and they are maybe a little more representative of someone's visual field. The next are some pen and paper tasks, like the trails. And the Trails B in particular has been a little more predictive of driving. The symbol digit modality has also been predictive of driving. And then you probably are most familiar with like the MVPT, the TVPS, the VMI, which are drawing tests, or where you point, they're motor free, where there's like 6 subtests like on visual spatial, visual memory, figure closure. They're all those visual perception skills. And then below that, I have the MMSE, the SLUMS, the MOCA, and they are more like cognitive assessments, albeit they have some little visual components to them. But then you have some combo assessments that are what I call a battery of assessments, kind of using pieces from all of, at least through the trails, and they might have a maze on it, and they might have a sort of a pseudo trails and some other executive function, maybe a letter cancellation task, and so forth. So the composites you will see being done in a lot of rehab, outpatient, and in driving programs too. The crux of it is there's no substitute for behind the wheel. And many therapists have a combination of different tests that they like to do. In my work with ADED, a therapist in Minnesota, Ann Clark, is working on, she calls it the driver risk calculator. And so basically it's like where if they score this on the MMSE and this score on some other test, it puts them in the red zone, So she's trying to calculate where this puts them. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to share that information with you, because I think therapists need this kind of tool. Now, I'm not going to go over all these assessments, but I sort of have chunked these more into cognitive assessments. And then you can download these PowerPoints that you kind of can see what the reliability and validity of some of these tools are as related to driving and the time it takes to give. So we've got cognitive assessments, we've got lots of them. And by the way, the cognitive linguistic test, some speech pathologists who screen people for driving use that one. The stroke driver screening assessment, which is a big one. I've already mentioned the MVPT, the visual search attention test, the Dynavision, confrontational assessment, the Snellen. Those are just your basic vision. I do want to mention the BIVAVBA, which is a hard one to say, brain injury visual assessment battery that kind of combines elements from all the levels of Warren's hierarchy into one vision, visual cognitive kind of assessment. It may take up to an hour. It's a little expensive, but a really good tool for working with people with brain injury. And I have seen people in driver rehab using that assessment. But okay, so what's the problem? The problem is that there is not one tool. Ann Dickerson says, you know, that's our never-ending quest is for one tool that's going to predict driving readiness. And I don't know that one tool will ever exist based on different diagnostic categories, right? So Charlene Klassen found that for people with Parkinson's, it's like some kind of walk test. It's like not the time get up and go, but the rapid pace walk test was most predictive of how they would do behind the wheel. Whereas with some people with brain injury, the Snellgrove maze is a better predictor than the rapid walk pace test. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, what we care about, though, is there are a limited number of driver rehab specialists available. It's like in Georgia, there might be like 5, right? And so if that's the case, it's going to take months to get in to see them. So we want to send our clients in the just right time period. We don't want to send them too soon. We might not want to wait too long because then they start driving on their own anyway, and then they get in an accident. So we want to save money. We want to use our resources as best as possible. And that's why I believe we need good screening tools beforehand. And that's what I'm saying in this next slide. Other than behind the wheel, there's no tools that really measures people's ability to move through space. Many of the tools that we are using as screening tools, the client is still. They are not moving through space as if they are driving. They are not navigating through space. And that's why I like this tool, the indoor mobility pre-driver screening tool. So what is the solution, right? Theoretically, the goal of this tool is the client walks through an environment. They have to navigate to a destination, navigate back. They got to be able to follow instructions, their time, and they call out signs along the way. And I'll have a demo of it. This tool came to us from Tracy Young, who works at Athens Regional and Outpatient Neuro Clinic. She was doing her low vision certificate with Mary Warren. Mary Warren basically was saying, if you're working with clients with low vision, just have them walk through an environment and call out things. And, you know, you'll kind of know if you think they're ready to go through a driver evaluator or not. And she developed this assessment and then came to us at Cornell University and said, like, hey, I've been using this for a few years. Can you help me standardize it and validate it? So we had several student projects, probably 8 or 9 different student projects on the validity of this tool and kind of standardizing it. Originally, Tracy called it the YEMAPS, the Young Indoor Mobility Assessment of Pre-Driver Screening or something like that. I abbreviated it. Originally, I called it the Tracy Young Dynamic Assessment of Vision. But this assessment is it's about more than dynamic vision. So the current name for the tool, which Tracy's on board with it, is the Indoor Mobility Pre-Driver Screening Tool. It combines many skills used in driving, and I kind of explained it a few minutes ago, but the key thing is they have to mobilize themselves through an environment. Now, the clients can use a wheelchair or a mobility device. We would just note that in the results. And particularly if they're using an electric scooter, that would be similar to when you drive, you're seated driving. So we want the client to do it as quickly as they can in a safe as possible way. Like if they are walking to the point where they're going to fall over, we might say to them, do you want to use your wheelchair for this? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. And sometimes we think they're better served doing it from a wheelchair, but, clients kind of can make their own choices. So this is the it has to have a hallway. It has to be somewhere between 125, 175 feet. The key thing is there's got to be at least one turn to the right, one turn to the left, and there's got to be something in their center visual field where they have to see an arrow sign telling them to go to the left and an arrow sign telling them to go to the right. We want the signs evenly spaced out at eye level. Right now, we added some points to it in 2018. It is a 100-point test, which, most people understand 100 points. It was originally a 75-point test. So some items on the test are memory, alternating divided attention, problem solving, head mobility, looking at midline, looking to the right, the left, acting on informational signs, wayfinding, and accuracy. And this is Tracy, and this was the original version of the test. So I'm just going to show this for a minute.
To find the pool. We have a pool in our department, believe it or not. And because it's in our department, you're not going to go through any doors marked to exit. Okay? And on the way, what I want you to do is point at all of those gray purple signs, and there's an example right there. You don't have to read them to me, but I want you to point to them, or you can read them, whatever you want. And if there's two, I want you to go 1, 2. So I know you saw both of them, okay? And you're going to go to the pool, and then I want you to come back here. Okay, and then if I'm having a patient do this, I say, okay, so just to recap, I want you to find the pool, I want you to point at all the signs, and I want you to come back here. What do I want you to do?
Go to the pool, point all the signs, and come back over here.
You got it. So once you cross that, through that door, then you're on.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Excellent.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2.
From the side.
Right here, pool.
Yeah, just the gray signs are really what I want you to point at.
All right, there. Left. 1, 2, 3. 4, 5 right here.
Okay, so she made it to the pool, so I'm not going to show you the way back. So that was Tracy's original way of doing the assessment. It was less laboratory-like. It was a little more casual. She didn't make them name the signs. And then we formalized the assessment. And the next slide will show you this. So I'm going to show you a couple minutes of this.
Many daily activities such as shopping, driving, and finding our way around different places require a skill called dynamic vision. The purpose of this assessment is to screen for your ability to move through an environment, find your way, and be aware of objects around you. What we are going to do is have you follow the white signs, like this, to find your way to a location marked destination in this building. Based on the location of the destination, you will not go through any doors. While you are looking for this destination, I want you to call out the signs that look like these, some with arrows and some without. Ignore all other signs, only call out these. This way I will know you are looking all around as you walk. The last thing I want you to do is come back here walking the same way that you left. So just to review, you're going to find the location marked destination. You're going to call out and point to every white sign along the way, and you are going to come back to the starting location. Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay, can you repeat the directions out loud to me?
Yes. So I'm supposed to go find a location that's marked destination, and then point out to the signs that says start or destination with an arrow, and then come back here.
And you have to call the signs out. You have to read what
Right.
they say. Okay. Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to time you and take notes so that I can remember everything. You take as long as you need. When you pass the sign labeled start, timing will begin. Remember that the signs look like this or like this. You can begin when you're ready.
Okay. Start. Destination, arrow. Restroom, janitor, office, destination arrow. Room 109, game room.
So you can see we formalized it, we standardized it. There are the same index cards. The turns are in it. We intentionally put it in an environment where there are distractions. We intentionally don't mind people walking in the hallway, because in reality, when you're driving, unexpected things happen. So that's what the more formal version, the lab, the clinic version, the standardized instructions are for this assessment. Let me go to the next slide. So I'm just going to really quick, just talk about some of the previous research. So the first study was, typically when you're developing an assessment, you do what they call concurrent validity, where you compare your assessment to some gold standard. And the two gold standards, we looked at 3 gold standard assessments: the symbol digit, the trails, and the UFOV, as Carlene Ball's version of the UFOV on the computer. And the only one we got correlations with was the symbol digit. And so that was that assessment. And then the next study, we repeated the same thing, only we did it with people with brain injury and non-brain injury. And we did not find significant relationships. We found clinical significance, but not statistically significant relationships. And we think some of that was the people who were brain injured were less acute, more years out, maybe a little more mild. And they still had current driver's license. So some of them were driving, which means they were probably higher functioning clients than those typically seen in, driver rehabilitation. The next slide was, we said, okay, well, we have this assessment. At this time, it was only 75 points. Can we take these 2 groups of people, brain injury, not brain injury, even though we know the previous brain injury people were higher functioning, they still had some symptoms of having long-term consequences of brain injury. And we compared the 2 groups and did a post hoc analysis, and we said, okay, what can our assessment accurately place people into a group of disabled people or well people? And we found that with brain injury, we were 72% accurate in our placement in the brain injury group. And with the non-brain injury group, we were 75%, our assessment was 75% accurate in placing them in the correct non-brain injured group. And we also did progressive t-tests looking at a cutoff score. And what we found, remember, it's at this point, it's a 75 point score. And we found that when the score was greater than 63 points, we could accurately predict that they were in the non-ABI group. And when a score, like at 80% accuracy, and when the score was less than 68, we could say they were probably 80%, 82%, I think, accurate, that they were in the ABI group. Notice there's a 5-point overlap, that our predictability, that's where it was about 70 some odd percent. So, that's good. So our assessment shows people with problems. Then the picture of the girl you saw doing the test, they actually compared the IMPS with the Dynavision in well people. And then the next group did it with ABI clients and non-ABI clients. And we did find some correlation between the IMPS and the Dynavision, particularly like the alternating subtest of the Dynavision. And then one of our latter studies a couple of years ago was we now added time to the score. And we went through and we have been collecting data on time, how long it takes somebody to do the course and get back. And we didn't know how to factor it into the total score. So we did kind of a complicated study where we added time into the score and then did a factor analysis. And that showed positive, good correlations, basically. I'll just keep it simple there. Well, now we're at Nick's project. And obviously the gold standard of whether the IMPS is a good test is if I can get people who do driver rehab to try my test or mine and Tracy's test, and then put them behind the wheel, that would be the ultimate validity study. But I don't have a driver rehab specialist to work with me on that. So the closest thing I could do is a driving simulator. So Nick Bolen, he actually has an OTD now. At the time of the project, he only had a master's. And he ran 36 participants and did the IMPS and the driving simulator for all the people. And so it was a straight, what they call concurrent validity. So the gold standard comparison tool is the driving simulator. And so it's a non-experimental assessment validity study. He used the EF driving simulator and then the IMPS assessment. And so what he was looking for, is there a relationship between these two scores? Each person came into the lab, took both assessments. He randomized, like half of them did the IMPS first and the other half did the driving simulator first to make sure it wasn't a carryover effect. And, the inclusion was that they had to have a current license. They could commit to an hour. Where did we get our participants from? The Council on Aging, friends, neighbors. And what we did, we intentionally got people like in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and all the way up to 80s. We didn't have any 90-year-olds. So that could be considered a weakness of the study. And I think I've already said this, but Nick collected all of this data, and I was just his mentor in the project. And so once we collected all the data, we entered it into SPSS. We did a descriptive analysis. I'll show the demographics in a minute. And then we ran Pearson's correlations. And then we did some post hoc analysis to see, was there any interesting data that, was within our sample. So here's the results. We had 36 participants ranging in age from 21 to 84 years old. Some had only been driving 5 years and some had been driving 66 years. Some people drove 2 days a week and some drove 7 days a week. Some only drove like maybe on average couple minutes a week, like in a day, or the time that they drove, up to 200 minutes per trip. So that's somebody who's commuting a long time or driving a lot for their job. This is just all of the scores on the items. So on the individual items for the IMPS, it's kind of like a 1 through 4 scoring mechanism. What we really want to look at is the total. So remember, these are community dwelling people. So you're not, if we look at the bottom line, 56 to 100, there were still some people who got a 56 out of 100. So some of those people had a little bit of problem on this test. And these are the scores. I'm not going to read all these, but I did want to tell you the 5 different subtests we used on the driving simulator. The first one was reaction time. So they see something in their field and they have to hit a mouse. Or no, they have to hit the brake on the simulator. The next test is cognitive abilities, and that's just where they do a drive without obstacles coming in their way. Can they maintain their lane? Can they maintain an appropriate speed? That is not with, situational things happening. The next subtest is visual field. That's like a UFOB. The next subtest is glare memorization. It's really more of a visual memory test. Something appears in your visual field and you have to remember where it was. You have to remember that you saw it, and then you have to identify where it was. It goes away, obviously, so that's visual memory. And then the last one is probably the most closely simulates driving. They actually drive in traffic. They have to make so many turns. There's a bus. They have to change lanes. They have to pull out a parking spot. There's a little ball that goes in the middle of the road. That's real stuff that happens in driving. Oops, sorry about that. And so we ran correlations between the IMPS total and each of the subtests on the simulator. And so the ones that I've highlighted, or Nick and I have highlighted in yellow, the p-value just means it's statistically significant. The correlation, the closer to 1 it is, like 0.99, would be like a major correlation. It almost means you copied their assessment. So really what we look for, high correlation is like 0.6 to 0.8, medium correlation 0.4 to 0.6, minimal correlation 0.3 to 0.4 or something, okay? So we've got some minimal correlations here, and you can see the most notable is the visual field of view, which kind of makes sense to us, right? Because our assessment is walking through an environment and you're calling out things in your visual field. Well, that makes sense to us. So there are 5. The ones that really visual memory, there wasn't a relationship between our assessment and visual memory, because there isn't much visual memory in our assessment. And then reaction time, there wasn't a relationship between reaction time, but there was with field of view, cognitive abilities, and at least one subtest of situational awareness. And then we did a post hoc analysis we thought, well, does age matter? Like, did the older people, as age goes up, the score go down? And that's what this is saying here, a little bit. It's not a major correlation, but it's 0.3. And then we did want to make sure the time was related to the total score on the IMPS, and it totally was at 0.874. And then we also looked at what we did. We grouped people into, as I said earlier, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And then we wanted to see, is there a difference in age grouping and the total scores or the simulation? And so we did see a difference in age groupings based on field of view and the IMPS total. So we kind of think, well, the IMPS obviously is sensitive to age, so older people might have a little more challenge with our test because you're moving through an environment. So if they move slower, which again, in a car, you might not be moving, right? You're not walking, you're driving. So it might be a little artifact there. And then the field of view might be because older people maybe don't have as good range of motion turning their head. It might be a neck thing. So the summary of the results are that we've had some correlations, maybe minimal, with cognitive abilities, maybe a little better correlations between our assessment and the field of view. And then there was a relationship to age and the IMPS. And then obviously IMPS time with the IMPS total, which makes sense because time is factored in to the total. So what do we, discussion wise, it's not surprising that the field of view correlated. We were kind of surprised that there wasn't a little more correlation between some of the cognitive subtests on the simulator. And maybe because the IMPS is not as challenging as the simulator might be. So we realize the limitation of our assessment is still a screening. We don't think it rises to the level of even a simulator or behind the wheel, but it might be a first step in deciding whether somebody should take the next step to be referred to a driver rehabilitation specialist. So again, ideally, it would be better if we could do the IMPS against the behind the wheel evaluation. I'm in the market for a driver rehabilitation specialist willing to add the IMPS, because the IMPS only takes like 5-10 minutes at most to do as part of their regular screener. Because if we find that it correlates with the pass-fail behind the wheel, then it might be an alternative for a clinical generalist to use before they refer on to a driver rehabilitation specialist. And so in summary, the IMPS does have good reliability, validity, might be useful as a screener. It incorporates, it's consistent with Warren's vision hierarchy and some other cognitive client factors. So I would just challenge each of you, even if you don't use the IMPS in practice, that you at least have your client walk through an environment to kind of make sure they can navigate, follow directions, and see things in their visual field as they are moving through space, which to me more closely simulates driving than does using the MVPT, which is like a static tabletop activity. So this concludes our presentation. We thank you for listening to it. Our references are on the next few slides. Thank you.
I don't see anything in the chat box right now, but we're such a cozy group that I'm sure anybody can just chime in. But Mary, I wanted to ask, okay, so with the way we're living now, I mean, and that's everything from Ubers to aging populations. What's the need for this? What's the demand?
Okay, well, first of all, like self-driving cars are a ways down the road. Ubers, Lyfts, etc., are not everywhere.
Yeah.
So, and even if you have a ride service and you're living in a rural area, you still may have to tell people, oh, it's there, to make a left there, because they missed their turn when they're bringing you to your doctor's appointment or whatever. So I still think even, I mean, self-driving cars, you know, might have some advantage when we get to the Jetson age of our life. But I think this concept is good, because if you think about it, this tool might not only relate to driving, right? It relates to walking through a grocery store and being able to scan your environment and find groceries and navigate up and down the grocery store.
That was going to be my question, Mary, about other applications for this tool.
Right, and that is why we originally didn't call it just the pre-driver screening, because we thought it's more than that. But then when we started doing more reading on dynamic assessment of vision, it's also more than that, right? It's cognitive, it's mobility, it's speed, it's, you know, so I don't know what we should call it, but I think also the idea came from the dynamic gait index, right? Which was, the dynamic gait index looks almost like the TIDAV, where you make people like turn their head and call out things as they walk up and down the hall. You'll see vestibular therapists use that, PTs and OTs. But that's about, as they turn their head, do they lose their balance? That's not really about, did they accurately identify the sign that said restroom or whatever, you know?
Right. You know, it's like chewing gum and walking at the same time, you know, that kind of.
And with older people in particular, you'll see they could do good on the MVPT, but then you put them in this test and they start walking down the hall and you distract them and talk to them and they stop in the middle of the road.
Well, one's a sedentary assessment, and the other is the mobility, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I was just wondering,